The number 40 caught the attention of a research team reviewing burn ward records, but it wasn't the number they expected to matter. There is a hospital in France, in the lavender country of Provence, where a particular practice survived longer than almost anywhere else in the industrialized world. Into the early decades of the 20th century, when a patient came in with a burn, before there were antibiotics to reach for, the dressing they reached for was made with lavender oil. Not because the doctors were romantics, because it worked, and they had watched it work, and the records they kept were careful. Then penicillin arrived, and the lavender went into the cabinet, and the cabinet went into storage, and a body of practical knowledge built over centuries simply stopped being used. Not because it failed, because something faster came along and made the slower thing seem unnecessary, rather than what it actually was, which was effective. I want to tell you about lavender today. Not the sachet in your sock drawer, not the candle, not the scent strip in a magazine. The actual plant, and what is actually in it, and why a Roman legion would carry it across a continent, and why a clinical trial in this century put a concentrated form of it head-to-head against a prescription sedative, and found something the researchers themselves described carefully, because the result was strong enough that careful was the only honest way to report it. Stay with me, because near the end I am going to tell you the one preparation mistake that almost everyone makes with this plant. The single step that drives off the exact compound you are trying to keep. And once you see it, you will never make tea the same way again. But let me start where the plant starts, which is much further back than Provence. The word itself tells you something. Lavender comes from the Latin lavare, to wash. The Romans named it for the bath because that is where it lived in their world. It went into the water that soldiers washed in, the water that wounds were cleaned with, the linen that the sick were wrapped in. Dioscorides, a Greek physician who served in the Roman army in the 1st century, compiled a work called De Materia Medica, a survey of the medicinal plants of the known world that remain the standard medical reference in Europe and the Islamic world for more than 1,000 years. That is not an exaggeration of its importance. Physicians copied it by hand for 15 centuries, and in it, lavender is recorded plainly, for wounds, for burns, for the headache that will not lift. A working soldier's medicine, written down by a man who treated working soldiers. Picture that for a moment. A legionary on the Rhine frontier, the northern edge of the empire, far from anything warm. The damp gets into everything. Wounds that should close do not close. A man carries, in the small kit that is his to manage, a handful of dried lavender, because the army has learned across generations of campaigns that pressing it into a wound or soaking cloth in water steeped with it changes how that wound goes. He does not know why. He knows that the men who do it tend to keep their limbs, and the men who do not, sometimes do not. That is the entire science he needs. It is enough. And here is what is striking. The Romans were not alone in this. Lavender-related compounds have been detected by chemical analysis in Egyptian mummification residues, the same preservation work where time shows up. Because the people doing the most demanding antimicrobial task any ancient culture ever attempted reached again and again for the aromatic plants that resist rot. Different civilizations, no shared notebook. The same plant, doing the same job, recorded independently. So what is in it? What were all of them circling without the words to name it? The primary active compound in lavender is a molecule called linalool. If that name sounds slightly familiar from somewhere, it should, because basil contains it too. But lavender carries it at far higher concentration, and that concentration is the whole story. Linalool's most documented action is on the GABA system in your nervous system. Let me explain what that means without the jargon, because the jargon hides how elegant this actually is. Your nervous system has an accelerator and a brake. GABA is the brake. It is the primary inhibitory signal in your brain, the thing that quiets neural firing, that turns the volume down when a system is running too loud. Anxiety, in a real physiological sense, is the brake not holding. The pharmaceutical drugs called benzodiazepines, the ones with names you would recognize, work by pressing on that brake. They make the GABA signal stronger. They are effective, and they are also habit-forming, and coming off them can be genuinely difficult. That is the trade. Linalool appears to act on that same braking system, but differently. It modulates rather than slams. And this is not a folk claim. A clinical trial published in the journal Phytomedicine studied an oral lavender oil preparation, a standardized one called Selexan, in people with generalized anxiety. The comparison drug was lorazepam, a pharmaceutical benzodiazepine. The trial found the lavender preparation comparable to the drug in reducing generalized anxiety scores, and it did so without the dependence and withdrawal that follow the pharmaceutical. I want to be exact about what that is and is not. It is the finding of a randomized controlled trial reported in the medical literature. It is not me telling you to stop a medication your doctor prescribed. If you are on something for anxiety, that is a conversation with your physician, not a decision to make over a cup of tea. What the trial tells us is that the thing the Roman army was carrying, the thing that Provence hospitals were dressing wounds with, contains a molecule that does something real and measurable to the human nervous system, strong enough to stand in a study beside a prescription drug. There is a second layer to lavender that gets less attention and deserves more, which is the antimicrobial side, the wound side, the reason it was in those burn dressings in the first place. Linalool and a related compound, linalool acetate, have shown documented activity against bacteria and fungi in laboratory conditions. That is why the Provence dressings worked before antibiotics, why Dioscorides put it on wounds, why the Egyptians reached for it in the embalming chamber. The plant produces these compounds to defend itself against the same microbes that threaten us, and we borrowed the defense. Human clinical wound trials are more limited than the laboratory work, and I am not going to overstate it. But the direction of the research is consistent, and it is the same direction the historical record was pointing in long before anyone could see a bacterium. Now here is the part that almost no one mentions, and it is the reason most people who try lavender at home get nothing out of it. Linalool is volatile. That word is doing real work. Volatile means it evaporates readily, it leaves with heat, it rides out of the cup on the steam. When you pour boiling water over lavender and let it sit open on the counter, you are watching the active compound, the entire reason you are doing this, lift off into the air. The pleasant smell filling your kitchen is not a bonus. It is the medicine leaving. The very fragrance you are enjoying is the linalool escaping the water you intended to drink. So you do two things differently. First, you do not use boiling water. You let it cool to around 85 degrees Celsius, just off the boil, hot but not violent. Second, and this is the step people skip, you cover the cup while it steeps. A saucer, a lid, anything. You trap the steam so the volatile compounds condense and fall back into the water instead of drifting into the room. 6 to 8 fresh flowering sprigs, or about a tablespoon of dried lavender flowers, in water, at that temperature, covered for roughly 8 minutes. Then, strain it, let it cool slightly, and drink it about half an hour before bed. The research on lavender for sleep suggests the effect is not a single dramatic night, but something that builds with consistency over 2 to 3 weeks, the break slowly learning to hold again. A word on the flowers specifically, since this matters and most guides blur it. The linalool concentrates in the flowering tops, not the woody stem, and not really the leaf. When you harvest, you want the buds and blooms. And the distinction between forms matters enormously here. A dried lavender sachet near your pillow works gently, through scent, through the olfactory pathway, and that is real, but mild. A covered cup of properly steeped flower tea is a different intensity. And a concentrated oral oil preparation, like the one in that anxiety trial, is different again. Strong enough that it belongs in the category of things you discuss with a doctor, not something to improvise at high doses. More is not better with this plant. The gentle, consistent, low dose is the one the evidence supports. If you want to grow your own, Lavender is more stubborn in water than the mints, but it can be done. Take a 4-inch cutting from a stem that is not flowering, strip the leaves off the lower 2 inches, and set it in a clean, narrow-necked jar of water out of harsh afternoon sun. Change the water every 3 days so it stays clean. Roots are slow, patient work here. For many people, lavender ends up easier as a small potted plant on a sunny sill than as a water cutting. And either way, the goal is the same, which is fresh, flowering tops within arm's reach of the kitchen. I want to slow down now and tell you about one specific evening, because there is a moment in Scripture that I cannot read the same way since I started understanding what plants like this actually do in a body. Go to the Gospel of John, the 12th chapter. Jesus is at a table in Bethany, days before the end. A woman named Mary comes in carrying a pound of pure nard, spikenard, an aromatic oil pressed from a plant that grew in the high Himalayas and had to be carried thousands of miles to reach that room. She breaks it open and anoints his feet, and the text says the fragrance filled the entire house. And then a man at the table, Judas, objects. He puts a number on it. 300 denarii, he says, nearly a full year's wages for a laboring man, poured out in a single gesture. Sit with that number. An aromatic botanical preparation valued at a year of a working man's life. Spikenard is a cousin in spirit to lavender, another of the high-value aromatic oils of the ancient world, traded across the same routes, prized for the same reasons. The ancient world did not assign that kind of value to a plant preparation casually, or on the strength of a single generation's whim. That valuation was built. It accumulated across centuries of people watching what these aromatic oils did, on wounds, on the sick, on the grieving, on the body under stress. The price was the memory of that observation, expressed in coin. That is not symbolism. In modern terms, in what the research on these aromatic compounds now understands about how molecules like linalool cross from the nose into the bloodstream and act on the nervous system, the value placed on a fragrance that filled a house is a recognition of something physiological. These compounds enter through the olfactory pathway, bypassing the slow route of digestion entirely, reaching the brain directly. The Romans knew it as the bath that calmed a soldier. The Provence physicians knew it as the dressing that healed a burn. Mary knew it as the most precious thing she owned, worth pouring out completely. None of them could have told you the word linalool or drawn you the GABA receptor it settles onto. They had something that took longer to build and is harder to fake. They had generations of people watching what happened to other people and remembering and passing it forward. The fragrance that filled that house was not waste, and it was not only devotion. It was the same chemistry the Roman carried on the Rhine, and the French doctor pressed into a burn, given its highest and most human meaning. The faith and the molecule are not competing in that room. They are describing the same true thing from two directions. So let me draw the line through all of it, the thing that runs underneath every part of this. The principle is this. The closer you stay to the living plant, the more of the actual material survives. Linalool is volatile. That single fact explains almost everything about why lavender so often disappoints people. It leaves with the steam. It leaves with the heat. It leaves in the industrial processing that boils and refines and stabilizes a plant into something that can sit on a shelf for 2 years. The thing that makes lavender worth taking is precisely the thing least able to survive the journey into a commercial product. The pleasant-smelling lavender lotion, the heated candle, the over-processed oil. These are the aroma of the compound leaving, packaged and sold back to you. What was removed is not a mystery and not a conspiracy. It is chemistry. Heat is heat. A volatile compound is volatile, whether it leaves your teacup or a factory vat. The molecules in a living plant were not built by nature to survive a manufacturing line. They were built to function in conditions much closer to a covered cup of just cooled water on a windowsill than anything that comes off an assembly line. The difference between a sachet's faint scent and a covered, properly steeped infusion is the difference between the aroma of the medicine and the medicine itself. And the ancient world understood this without needing to name it, because it had no other option. The Roman had a fresh sprig and a basin of warm water. The monk had a courtyard of growing plants and a clay pot. The French physician had a field of Provence lavender at the back door. Every one of them was working from the primary source, the fresh material, because there was no factory to stand between them and the plant. They did not have our vocabulary. They had something we have largely lost, which is uninterrupted observation, conducted over centuries in conditions that required the plant to actually work, because when it did not, people died. And the failure was remembered too. So here is the question I would leave you holding, not for tonight, but for tomorrow. When you are standing in a store aisle, looking at a shelf of clear, uniform, beautifully packaged bottles, the question is not which plant you will grow. It is this: when the smell of a thing is the strongest impression it makes on you, what does that tell you about where the active part of it has already gone? And how much of what these plants were meant to do have we been quietly selling each other the scent of, while the substance drifts off into the air? If this kind of conversation matters to you, hit like and subscribe, and share this with someone in your life who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling me whether you already grow lavender and what you have noticed, because I read every single one, and what I cover next often comes straight from what you tell me. New content every week. We are just getting started.